We're not exactly sure how Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor that had some responsibility in overseeing the trial of Christ, we're not sure how he felt after the fact. I wonder if that's somewhat of an accurate prediction of what he struggled with. Last week, the last couple of weeks, we looked at the Roman or the Jewish part of the trial. Today we transition to the Roman part of the trial of Christ, where we find ourselves in Luke chapter 23, looking at verses 1 through 12 today. And we're talking about how to respond when things get worse. It had been a really difficult time for Christ. He'd been betrayed by everybody. I was reading this week a news article about the secret police of the East Germans, referred to as the Stasi, during the Cold War era. They were known for infiltration into many different ranks. They were also known for their meticulous record keeping. And when the Cold War ended, they were basically asked to shred all of their documents. And so in some cellar in an East German or in a Berlin government office, there's some 15 to 16,000 bags, large bags of shredded paper. Almost impossible to go through until there's some modern technology that enables you to scan over the pages and glean some of the info. And so they're publishing some of the info of the Stasi, and much of what they did involved forcing or hiring out spies that would go into neighborhoods, families, businesses, churches, and would place people to find out all that was going on. And it's causing some family dinners to get a little awkward, because they realize now that grandpa, who may be deceased or who may be in elder care home, he spied on everybody in the neighborhood or in the family and gave secret information to the Stasi. Also, there were some church members that went into German churches that were hired out by the Stasi, looking at fellow church members and even sweet, precious, innocent pastors that they spoke against, you know. So I think they ought to stop the dissemination of that information. It is hurting church potluck dinners and things of that nature. And betrayal really hurts when someone you thought you could trust stabs you in the back. We saw that a few weeks ago when Judas betrayed Christ. His own countrymen, who didn't seem to ever care for Christ, but maybe the hope was that at least the Jewish blood would mean something. They certainly betrayed him in the early part of the trial. And now there's someone who may not feel like official betrayal, but at least justice is betrayed, because what we find out in the story is that Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, a Roman official, knew so clearly that Christ was innocent. He had the power to stop all the madness, but instead he moved forward, even though in his heart he knew that they were lying about him and Christ had done nothing deserving of death. And so things aren't getting better for Christ, they're getting much worse. Do you ever feel like you're having one of those seasons of life where the harder you try, things don't get better, they get worse? And maybe you feel even more bothered about things getting worse when you're for once doing the right thing. I think we feel a little more justified or a little more angry when we're living right. We seem to be, not perfectly, but for the most part, doing right, and our circumstances are crumbling around us. That's kind of how the Christian life works, by the way. I hate to inform you of that. But, I mean, Paul the Apostle said in 1 Corinthians 15:19, he said this: if only for this life we have hope in Christ, we're to be pitied above all men. Because Paul did the right thing much of the time, and he got beaten in prison and run out of every city. So doing right doesn't mean things get better circumstantially at first. Like your orthopedic surgeon will tell you, things will get worse before they get better. But how do you respond in those very difficult times? There's a few ways in this passage we're going to see today. Let me first of all read verses 1 and 2 of Luke 23, where it says, "Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Christ, a king.'" Now, basically, they had illegally had a trial in the middle of the night, through the night, and now I guess the flicker of a candle came on in the palace where Pilate lived, and so they rush over there with a pack of lies, and wake up the governor and say, hey, this guy needs to be tried in a capital punishment scenario because he's done at least these three things. And so the first thing they said is, we found this man subverting our nation. They're claiming that he was an insurrectionist, rebel rouser that wanted to take down the Jews, or maybe their implication was our nation, as in we're all good Roman citizens. He's not being a good Roman citizen. Also, they say he opposes payment of taxes to Caesar. By the way, don't think that cancel culture started in 2020 or anything like that. This is an attempt at first century cancel culture. Basically, when you try to cancel somebody, it's not that you have to find anything truthful about the person. You basically, a lot of cancel culture, however you want to broadly define the basically getting rid of a voice that has done something in the past that was inappropriate then and now, and wipe them off the face of the earth. Basically, a lot of cancel culture runs with a lie, a bald-faced lie. It is true, though, that Jesus talked about taxes, just not like this. Some of you listened to a sermon of mine several months ago where we looked at the phrase from the Gospel of Luke, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's. Some of you don't like to be reminded of that great truth because Jesus seemed to be saying, hey, be a good citizen. Pay your dues to the state. Yes, we don't like how they're been spent most of the time, but it's part of our citizenship to pay your taxes. But mostly we're accountable to God. So yeah, Jesus talked about taxes, but in the opposite way. But that doesn't matter. When you hate someone so much that you want to cancel them, you aren't worried about truth. And then they claim to be Christ, a king. So one of the things that happens when you want something so bad is that you're not opposed to using wrong means to get there. You want it so bad and it feels and seems right to you. You're able to leave everything else behind you so you can focus on that one thing. And that's exactly what they were doing, and that's what we must avoid doing. Number one on the outline is avoid doing wrong to make things, quote, right. There's a wrong they did. These are people that preached the Ten Commandments. And one of the key ones was, thou shalt not bear false witness. They are lying like a water comes out of a waterfall. Just a flow of nonstop lies. But Jesus was so annoying to him and so harmful for the Jewish nation that they would do anything to accomplish their goal of meeting him out. Be careful when you come to the place where you want something so bad and it feels so right to you that you'll do anything to get what you want. They'd lost a sense of perspective and truth, and that's what we must avoid doing when things get worse. Now, Pilate, he didn't really care that they claimed that this man in front of them was subverting a nation. He didn't care about the Jews. He certainly didn't think that he had any influence to try to take down the nation of Rome. And he also didn't care if he spoke against taxes, because here was a bleeding, traveling speaker and magician as far as Pilate was concerned. And he's a weak man broken in front of him, and if he says he's speaking against taxes, he's got a bunch of goons outside that beat taxes out of the Jews for a living. He's not too worried that this guy says something bad about taxes. But it did concern him that they said he was a Christ, a king. Because that could be bad for his job. If word got out that there was a true insurrectionist and there was a king of the Jews, that they wanted to start a monarchy again after centuries of not having one, and that they tried to rise up against Rome, well, that could get to Caesar, and then all of a sudden, Pilate would be out of his bureaucratic political job, and he'd be pushing pencils somewhere. And so all of a sudden, he's thinking, you know what, I need to check into that. He doesn't look like a king to me, but let me just go ahead and ask. So in verse 3, he says to him, so Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? I wonder if he said that with a smirk on his face. You? Not real royal looking there, pal. Yes, it is as you say. So Jesus affirmed it, but when he says it is as you say, what he meant was, technically I'm a king, but not in the way that you're thinking about kingship. Now, it's true that Luke has a sort of a shortened version of the trials and a more full explanation is found in Matthew and especially in John. And right in this point in John 18:36, Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world." Would you mind saying that phrase with me? Ready? My kingdom is not of this world. By the way, let's try to remember that our kingdom isn't here. That's why Jesus says, don't store up treasures for yourself on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal. But store up treasures in heaven. Don't worry about making a name for yourself, being powerful, being wealthy, influential, and building your empire here, because this is all fleeting. This is not real. This does not last. He says, my kingdom is in the place to come. It's in the world to come. We live here, but we live for another place. We live for another agenda, not the agenda of this world. We live in light of the next. And so don't let anything, including a love for something that could be true and right, replace affection for the King whose kingdom is coming. But what gets me about Christ, what I'm so impressed with, just as someone who communicates, is that he doesn't address all the other lies going about him. He doesn't address the snarkiness which Pilate likely asked him. Wouldn't you, if you were listening to all these lies about you, wouldn't you want to say, yes, it's true, I am a king, but first of all, let me address those clowns that were speaking, that were accusing me. I didn't do any of that stuff. Wouldn't you be so tempted to do that? But what I take away that's helpful to us when things get worse is number 2 on your outline is this, is to keep controlled faithfulness when criticized. Well, it doesn't take much to irk our pride and bring out from us sort of a retaliation when people are speaking ill of us. I read an article this week by Pastor Scott Sauls of Nashville, and he commented that some time ago, a person that visited his church spoke out against him on social media. And they spoke specifically against something he said in a recent sermon. And so it got his attention, and so he went and responded and said, hey, that's not really what I said. What I said was this, and here's what the verse that kind of backs up what I'm trying to say. Well, that poked the social network bare, and so 4 or 5 comments that basically twisted, allegedly, the pastor's words and took some things out of context, and, well, the pastor couldn't help but get those fingers moving again on the keyboard and responded in another way that turned out not to be helpful. So his friend, one of his big brother pastor's mentors, was sort of watching a Christian Twitter war break out. And he texts Pastor Scott and says, Scott, you have forgotten not to wrestle with pigs. Now, in saying that, the point was not that people that speak against preachers or against sermons are pigs. The point is, he didn't know this person, and this person had nothing but criticism. It'd be certainly a better place to discuss things than out in the open. And this mentor went on to say that when you wrestle with pigs, everybody gets real muddy, and the only one that enjoys the wrestling match is the pig. Have you ever noticed if you wrestle with pigs, you start getting pig-headed yourself? And if retaliation becomes our first move and defensiveness, we set ourselves up for a really horrible habit, and that's this habit of rejecting all criticism. In your most spiritually sane moments, when someone said something critical of you, if you had the audacity to stop and listen and try to receive it, did you ever find that you learned something that you needed to hear? I mean, I don't think anybody should enroll in a ministry, therefore, of criticism, but it's used of God so many times. And if we're secure in Christ and He's our righteousness, and we already have the one who matters most, loves us no matter what, we don't have to strike back. We can be like Christ and have this secure sense of controlled faithfulness that manages our tongue and our finger and our heart. You know, it was D. Martin Lloyd-Jones, the pastor and author, that says if someone says something ill of me, I realize they can never say something truly bad enough. He says, I know far more horrible things about myself than anyone could ever say. I like that, don't you? If someone starts criticizing you, why don't you say, hey, you're missing several things. Let me help your list. It's a lot longer than that, pal. In verse 4, then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. Now, this is an incredible thing to say, right? So okay, I've heard what you said. I've listened to this, and you've been trying all night. You know what? Case closed. You guys, you're lying. I know he's innocent. He's harmless. So, thank you for coming. Well, have you ever noticed that crowds in the world are very persistent? They don't give up so easily. In verse number 5, but they insisted, and that's exactly what the theys do, is they insist. He stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. All of a sudden, Pilate realizes, oh man, I've got to make a tough call. I hate tough calls. Do you blame him? We hate tough calls, don't we? We hate those decisions where someone's going to be hurt and we're going to be bothered and it's going to take up so much time and how can I get out of this? And music to his ears when the crowd said the word Galilee. And so he's going, don't kid me. Are you saying that you're from Galilee? In verse 6, on hearing this, Pilate asked the man if he was Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at the time. The evil laugh is probably going on, I don't have to make this hard decision. My old enemy, Herod Antipas, came in town for the Passover. He's here. This guy's from Galilee. You know what? Not my problem. Now, it's true that politicians generally like to claim responsibility for their actions. In this one instance, they didn't. It was Will Rogers that says two epics in American history are the passing of the buffalo and the passing of the buck. We love to shirk responsibility for things that are ours and put it off, either ignore it or let someone else do it. And the reason it's hard for us to give up and resist passing the buck is because we often let public opinion determine truth. That's the principle in number 3 on your outline. Resist letting public opinion determine truth. Listen, truth is not up for debate. It doesn't mean that our perception of every aspect of truth is always perfect, but we're not looking for truth if we're followers of Christ, because Christ is the way and the truth. And he's given us a written record of his truth in the Word. So we're not truth seekers. We're not being bludgeoned by the 2021 crowd that claims to have the most perfect updates on truth ready to shame us with. We've already found the truth. But even us get deeply influenced by the lure of public opinion. Did you ever hear about the older man and his son that were bringing a donkey in from town? They were bringing it back to their home, and they're walking this donkey, and some of the neighbors look at them and start laughing and say, look at them, there's 2 people, and one of them could be riding a donkey. That's ridiculous. And so the dad puts up his young son on the donkey, and they ride along. After a little bit further down the road, you notice some neighbors kind of pointing and say, isn't that horrible? Look at that old man. And his young son is riding on there. He has young, strong legs. That old man should be up there. And the man caught wind of it. So he took his son down. He got up and kind of waved and moved on. After a while, someone who hadn't seen how things had gone previously looked up there and said, what a shame. That little poor boy is walking all by himself. I bet his legs are so tired. And so dad's like, yanks the kid, puts him up there. They get closer to their destination, but there's still some folks that are outside and kind of gather, and they point and look up at them, and they say, that poor donkey. Look at that beast of burden. I bet he is so tired. Speaking of tired, Dad was tired of it all, so he said, let's get down, son. And so they did. The only thing left to do is they picked up the donkey and carried the donkey back to the farm. And if you let public opinion determine truth, you're going to be carrying donkeys the rest of your life. The truth is, Christ is the way and the truth and the life. And he says, my truth I give them. I will sanctify them by my truth. Don't let public opinion determine what is right and wrong. Well, verse 8 starts out good, doesn't it? When Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased because for a long time he'd been wanting to see him. And if you stop there, you think for a moment that this is awesome. I mean, a very influential political leader is about to talk to Christ. He could hear the good news and all of Galilee could be forever transformed. But the only problem is that's just verse 8a. 8b says this: from what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. Oh. So he had a vested interest in getting something from Christ. So Christ comes before the Tetrarch of Galilee, and he says to Jesus, hey, here's a couple of loaves and fishes. Do your Shazam thing on them where they become like feeding thousands. And here's I'll draw you a bathtub of water, and I want to see if you could walk on water. Come on, perform, would you? And Jesus looks at him and says, I'm not your sideshow, and I don't perform on cue. Some of you parents may have learned that before. I remember when our kids would say something funny or do something that we thought was cute when they were little. We'd ask them to do it for other people, and it always never worked. One Christmas, they were singing some Christmas carol at home, and we were at my parents' house for Christmas. I said, Papa, Nana, come out here, listen. All right, boys, y'all sing that verse of Hark the Herald Angels Sing like you did for us. And I'm like, ready, go. And they're like, They're like, we're not your cute little sideshow, Dad, okay? I think that's how Jesus is. We want him to do something great, but when he doesn't do it, that we get quite upset with him, like Herod does. In verse 9, he piled him with many questions, but he gave him no answer. Isn't that interesting? Now, Christ was not chatty Charlie here. He wasn't a man of many words, but he spoke to every group except for Herod. And the reason he didn't speak to Herod is not specified, but it seems that he sensed that Herod had no desire for truth. He didn't have any desire to really understand things. He wanted a spectacle to be made, and so he didn't reveal himself to the person that didn't respond positively to what he'd already heard. I think that may be the case as well today. If you have an ulterior motive, your understanding of the gospel is often limited. Sometimes you only come to Jesus when you are broke or broken. And I'm not saying if you have a disease, you shouldn't call out to God. If you've not been walking to God and you have some problem in your family or your life, you should call out to God. But if I were you, I would call out to God repenting of sin as well. And I would call out to him trusting that if he doesn't answer your prayer request in the way that you're asking it, that he is still in charge and sovereign and good. But this wasn't working out like Herod thought. And so in verse 10, the chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there vehemently accusing him. This was downright rude for a political leader of this ilk to ask a subject a question and for them to remain silent. And so you know what? They make him pay. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, dressing him in an elegant robe, and they shipped him back. They sent him back to Pilate. Pilate, I'm sorry. It's back to you, pal. I can't handle this guy. He wouldn't talk to me. He wouldn't do any cool stuff. And so, back to you. Tag, you're it. Number 4 this morning about when things get worse is don't seek to use Jesus for your amusement. He's not there to perform for you. He is God, and you don't make up the rules on how to relate to him. He makes them up, and we respond to him accordingly. He is still Lord, whether he answers and acts in a way that you wish he would. Now, verse 12 is the only reference to this particular aspect of the story in any of the Gospels. It says this: that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they'd been enemies. Now, isn't that interesting? They had been enemies before that. We're not told as to what they were upset about. It could be back in chapter 13 when Pilate in the area of Galilee greatly punished a group of Galileans for something. Nonetheless, they didn't like each other. But they became friends. What was the root of their friendship? What was the source of that united them together? Their root was basically this: they both had a disdain of Jesus. They didn't want to deal with Jesus, and that brought them together. I have some encouragement for you this morning, and that's this. If you're in a season of your life where you're not walking with God, make sure that you don't make close friends with people. Because it is easy to form alliances if you're not close to Christ with other people that are not close to Christ. Disillusionment with Jesus, with truth, they love to flock and form alliances and fellowship with one another. Sometimes that happens with well-meaning Christians, and they have a common cause together, and that's this: they both love to gossip and slander about everybody else. And so that propensity to speak ill of others draws them in a really weird bond. Sometimes under the name of prayer and Christ. It's not hard for people to find habits that dishonor God, to bind them and unite them together. I want to throw this out there. If you're a single Christian and you're praying, you're at a place in your life where you're praying for a spouse, make sure that you don't fall in love with somebody that doesn't love Jesus. Form that pursuit with someone who is centered on Christ. And by the way, be honest about it. Don't give me this, no, Pastor, for real. He loves Jesus. I know he does deep inside. And he's getting more spiritual. I mean, the other day I sneezed and he said, God bless you. I mean, he's talking, he said, God, did you hear that? God bless you. Be honest, man, and let Christ-centeredness draw you together to form some incredible bond. I will tell you this, there is nothing like two people, two friends, or two people called to marriage that take this journey together and both are going in the exact same direction, and it's toward Christ. It's a powerful force. And so I want to encourage you today to let your alliances be centered around Christ. This week I met some new person that moved in the area that wanted to meet me. They moved in the villages, and he was a fellow pastor who retired and had my dad for class back in seminary back in the day, and we're at that Mission barbecue place in Lady Lake, and I was there at noon, and you hear this announcement that says, ladies and gentlemen, please stand. Every day at noon we stand and say the national anthem. And so everyone stands, gets their hand over their heart. You start singing the national anthem, wiping barbecue sauce off your face. And it was actually, as weird as it was, I'd never been there, I never heard of them do that before. It was a powerful moment. And for a brief moment, everyone in the room, we were all Americans. Nobody went around and asked who you voted for. No one went around and asked what you think about COVID policy or foreign policy. But for this brief moment, everybody was just one thing. And then I sat down and continued I can also bond with people very well over brisket, so we continued that. But I want you to know, if you're a follower of Christ, that should be the most important part of who you are. And that can bind us together in the strongest of ways. And so I want to encourage you, number 5 on your outline, is to form relationships around the right things. Because it is easy to form a relationship with something, even has to do with Jesus, but in a negative way. And that's what happened to Pilate and Herod. They formed a reliance about Jesus, but about their distaste of Jesus. Make sure that you form one in the right way. The most important part about this part of the Gospel of Luke is what we're headed toward, and that is to the cross. And the cross is where the sinless one paid the full payment for the sinners like us. There's much helpful life lessons we can learn about our walk with Christ from observing what we saw today. But the most important thing is knowing Christ in a personal way. And if you've never come to the place where you've trusted Christ alone to save you, my encouragement, if you're watching us online or right here in the room, is let today be the day of salvation where you own up to your desperate need of Him and call upon His name and be saved.